The talk today is about wild orchids. Now, I'll concentrate mainly on, at least to begin with, on Hampshire and Dorset, but later on go a little bit further afield to capture some of the orchids that you can't see in Hampshire and Dorset. And I'll at least initially do it in time sequence, starting with orchids in April, and then May, and then the main season, which is basically June. So the first slide shows a couple of interesting pictures. On the left is a field full of quite large orchids for British orchids. And the size of the orchid is a clue that these are all hybrid orchids, as we'll talk about later. And this is a hybrid swarm. On the right-hand side, you've got a beautiful picture of a sawfly orchid, which is a Mediterranean orchid. But the photograph was taken in Dorset a couple of years ago. The orchid isn't there anymore, so I don't think we can count it as a native orchid. How it got there in the first place, I don't think anybody knows. Might have been planted, it might have been a stray seed from somewhere. Yeah, I thought I'd begin with some orchid facts to set the scene. There's more than 25,000 orchid species worldwide, and 1 in 12 flowers around the world is an orchid. So orchids are the second most common species of flower around the world. In the UK, people tend to think we don't get orchids, wild orchids in the UK, but there are about 56 native orchids, plus or minus 3 or 4. The pictures just show a couple of Mediterranean orchids. On the nice yellow one is a yellow bee orchid, and the one on the right is a bishop's orchid. So let's carry on with some more facts. The thing about orchids is they're highly specialized. So they basically evolved to grow in quite hostile habitats where other plants can't easily grow. So in the context of the UK and Hampshire and Dorset, you're talking about the thin soil in chalk hills, dark woodland, sometimes extremely dark, damp grasslands, and even in bogs. For example, the New Forest bogs. The other thing about orchids is they're reliant on fungi, particularly for germination, but also for growth. And some orchids are completely reliant. The picture shows the bird's nest orchid, photograph taken from Chappitt's Wood up in the Meon Valley. This plant doesn't photosynthesize at all. So it can grow in a really dark part of the wood where there's no light, where nothing else grows. So there's no competition. It relies 100% on the fungus in the ground. Not a very pretty orchid, I think you'll agree, but quite an interesting one from the scientific point of view. The most common orchid, which I'm sure many of you have seen, is the common spotted orchid. This basically grows everywhere. It likes alkaline soil, but it also likes neutral soil, and it even grow in slightly acid soil. So it'll grow in open grassland, in woodland, in marshland, on roundabouts, by the side of motorways. You see it absolutely everywhere. As the name suggests, it has spotted leaves, so you get dark spots on the leaves. Unfortunately, not all common spotted orchids have spots. Some of them have no spots. Some of them have very, very faint spots. So you can't rely on the spotted leaves for identification. Also, other orchids also have spots, so it's a help, but it's not definitive. The color varies from very pale white to quite dark purple. One key thing to look for is the 3 lobes on the lip. You have basically 3 lobes, and the central lobe is often very long, longer than the other two, and it looks a bit like a tooth. So if the plant you're looking at basically has spots on the leaves and a long tooth, it's 99% certain it's a common spotted orchid. Also, the markings on the lip, which you can see, tend to be solid lines and swirls. So that's another feature of common spotted orchids. We'll see other orchids are quite similar to this. So it's often quite tricky to identify. So it's April now. So if you want to go see orchids in April, well, the weather's been very cold, so it's probably going to be a bit of a late season this year. So probably you're talking about towards the end of April. A good place to start is the Durlston Country Park, which is in Swanage. Sorry, let me just see if I can get the slide show to go again. There we are. Sorry, I've got it working. Spotted the problem. Okay. So Durlston Country Park in Swanage is really good. And there are several kinds of orchids there in April. You might see 3 kinds, 2 of which are shown here, and the other one in the next slide. The great thing about Durlston is if you go to see the wardens, they will tell you exactly where the orchids are. So within 5 minutes, you can be looking at the orchids. The other place that I've mentioned is Dancing Ledge. At Durlston Country Park, you'll probably find maybe a dozen, for example, of the early spider orchids. If you go to Dancing Ledge, you'll probably find about 800 of them over quite a large area, but there are an awful lot of them. The one on the left is the early spider. It's an ophris, and it mimics insects. It's supposed to mimic a spider. You can see it's got 2 little fake eyes. It's got sort of fur mimicking fur that you often see on spiders. And the idea is the spider comes along and tries to mate it with it. The spider gets no satisfaction, but the flower gets fertilized. So it's a bit mean of it, really, but that's what orchids tend to do. The one on the right is early purple orchid. Again, has spotted leaves, so it can be confused with a common spotted, but the common spotted doesn't usually come out in April. So if you see this in April, it's probably an early purple. A key feature is the spots, which tend to be in the central area of the lip and in the mouth here, around the mouth, whereas the common spotted has swirls and loops. So if we move on towards the end of April, in Hampshire, in Bishop's Waltham, there's the Hoe Road Meadow, which is just a field. And one of the things you find in the field in April is this orchid here, which is the green-veined orchid, Anacamptis morio. It's a fairly dainty orchid, so it's not very big, probably maybe 4 or 5 inches for a big one. And it's very easy to identify because it has these green veins around its bonnet. It doesn't have spotted leaves, but it does have these markings only in the central part of the lip. And they can be faint, or they can be strong, or they can not be very many of them, but it always has some of them. The color is usually purple, but you can get pink ones that I've shown here, and you can even get white ones as well. That's a really nice one, and if you can find Hoe Road Meadow, you will find these quite easily. Again, in April, late April, we can go to Chappitt's Wood, which is near West Meon in the Meon Valley. Chappitt's Wood is an area of ancient woodland, and the trees have been there for hundreds of years. So basically, it's got a really well-established fungal colony. So the orchids have got all the fungi they need to grow. The one on the left is the sword-leaved helleborine, which is a kind of orchid, and it's a really rare orchid nationally. But in Chappitt's Wood, there are hundreds of them. There are a few other sites where there are quite a lot of them, but generally you won't find them unless you go to these special sites. This one here is fully open, doesn't open much more than it has. The yellow marking you would think is pollen, but it isn't pollen. It's fake colouring to fool the flies and the bees to come and pollinate it. So again, it's being very mean. It's taking from the insects, but not giving anything in return, which I guess must mean it's less energy for it to do that than really to give the insects pollen. As the name implies, you can partly recognize it by the very sword-like leaves, which you can kind of see in this picture. They're long and thin. The one you also find at Chappitt's Wood, the white helleborine, which is part of the same family, Cephalanthera. And side by side here, we've got a white helleborine on the left and a sword-leaved helleborine on the right. Rather confusingly, the white helleborine is actually cream, whereas the sword-leaved helleborine is white when you see them side by side. The white helleborine doesn't open much more than that one there shown in the picture, a little bit more, but not much more. They also come slightly later, a week or two later than the sword-leaved helleborine. Seen as they're the same genus, they hybridize with each other. So when you go to Chappitt's Wood, you'll see sword-leaved helleborines, white helleborines, and hybrids, which makes life very confusing. So if you're really keen to identify a true sword-leaved helleborine, it might be quite difficult. But if you want to see some beautiful plants, it's great. There'll be hundreds of them, and they're easy to find. Also at Chappitt's Wood, you find this very strange plant here. It's a fly orchid. It's an ophrys. Again, it mimics insects, and flies attempt to mate with this particular orchid and thereby pollinate it. And I think this one is really quite realistic. It really does look like a fly to me. Again, you can see the little eyes. I think it's amazing, this one. And on the right is a very rare variant of the fly orchid. It is a fly orchid again, but it's lost its dark coloration. But otherwise, it's the same. Genetically, it's the same as a fly orchid. They're quite difficult to find at Chappitt's Wood. But if you see people around, you can ask them, and normally that's the way you find the orchids. We now come to the main orchid season, which is early to mid-May to early to mid-July, when a whole pile of orchids come into flower. This is one of my favorites. This is a bee orchid, and again, it's an ophrys, so it's mimicking bees. And again, you can see the kind of furry coat that it's got. It's got the two eyes again, and it's not thin like a lot of flowers. They're You know, they're made of paper. They're paper thin. This is quite a fat thing. So it really is mimicking a bee. It's fat like a bee. Quite how it evolved to become like that, it's hard to imagine, but but it's an amazing orchid. The places to find it, the easiest is probably the George pub on Portsdown Hill. Outside the pub, there's a kind of rock garden. And certainly a couple of years ago, there were a couple of bee orchids growing in the rock garden. It's also a really good excuse to go to the pub. It's quite a nice pub on the top of Portsdown Hill. They also occur in small numbers in Claylands, which is a nature reserve in Bishop's Waltham. There's only one or two there. The real place to see them is Dancing Ledge, or just west of Dancing Ledge in the Purbex. Again, you'll see probably in a good year 500 or 600 bee orchids up on the cliffs overlooking the sea, just west of Dancing Ledge. The orchid hotspot in Hampshire is Nor Hill, which is round the back of Selborne, where there are medieval chalk pits. And you can find 11 orchid species at Nor Hill at different times, not all at the same time of year, but if you go in any particular month, you'll probably find half a dozen of the different species. This is just one of them. This is a fairly common orchid. The pyramidal orchid is the shape of a pyramid, so it's easy to identify. And again, the color goes from purple to pink to white in a few cases. Can also be found on Portsdown Hill, opposite the George pub again, and in other places. That's quite a nice orchid. Some more orchids from Nor Hill. The top left, this one here is the common tway blade. I kind of think of this as something out of Lord of the Rings. I think it's either a sleeping elf or something like that. And I think at night it probably comes alive and starts walking around. It really is a strange looking flower. On the right here, we've got the chalk fragrant orchid, and this has a delicate fragrance. There are other kinds of fragrant orchid that have really strong fragrances. There's quite a lot of these at Nor Hill. This one on bottom left here is a frog orchid. I think the person who named this must have been drunk, because I can't see any resemblance to a frog in that particular flower. They're quite difficult to find at Nor Hill. There's only one or two places where they are, so you might have to ask around there. But Nor Hill is famous for this little orchid here, the musk orchid. It's a rare orchid, not found in many places, but at Nor Hill there are hundreds of them by the main footpath up into the main reserve. They're very tiny, so you can easily miss them, and they're not really a very impressive looking plant, but they are quite rare. So if you want to see orchids, Nor Hill is the place to go, probably in May or June or both. The other place to go is Martin Down, which is Salisbury way. And you can find 10 orchid species there, and a lot of rare butterflies. You also find rare butterflies at Nor Hill. The one on the left is a greater butterfly orchid, and that's quite a big orchid, so if you see one, it's easy to see, you won't miss it. Quite a beautiful orchid. The speciality at Martin Down is the burnt tip orchid, which is this one here. It's called burnt tip because the flowers at the top look as though it's been burnt at the top before they open. Again, that's quite difficult to find. It is by the main footpath, but you have to go a long way into the reserve to get to them. Seeing as we've mentioned butterflies, I thought I'd show a few photographs of the butterflies. They really are beautiful. And this is a speciality, the Duke of Burgundy. Also get some fritillaries. This is a marsh fritillary. That's a fritillary as well. So if you go on a sunny day, you can get orchids and butterflies. So what more could you ask for as a natural history buff? And my wife says turtle doves. You also get turtle doves at Martin Down because we've seen them once when we went. Of course, the New Forest is an area of ancient forest, and there are lots of orchids in the New Forest. The problem is the New Forest is gigantic. So you can walk a long way to try and find orchids in the New Forest. Of course, the New Forest is acidic soil, so you're likely to find different kinds of orchid. A good place to go where there are lots of orchids in a small space is Boundway Hill, which is near Sway in the New Forest. And this orchid here, the Heath Spotted orchid, it's very similar to the common spotted orchid. It has spotted leaves, the same. It looks very similar. It has spots and swirls. The colors are the same. The one difference is it doesn't have this tooth-like piece on the lip. You can see it's a very small protrusion here, whereas the common spotted was very long. But the main reason to identify it is this grows in acid soil, whereas the common spotted is highly unlikely to. It likes neutral or alkaline soil. This one also has a remarkably wide lip. It's a lot wider than it is long. So it's quite an impressive orchid. And this one here, also found at Boundway Hill, as well as other places, is a marsh helleborine. And this is quite a large orchid. I think it's quite a stunning orchid when you look at it up close. Quite complex. And you can often get dozens of them together in a field. And they really do look very impressive when you find that. If we're brave and venture into actual bogs, there are orchids growing in the bogs. They tend to grow on little tussocks of grass in the bogs themselves. So you're likely to get your feet wet if you try to photograph these. But this one here is a heath fragrance. It's a cousin of the chalk fragrant that we saw earlier, and this one really does smell quite beautiful, quite strongly. And this one here is an early marsh orchid, and I think there are 3 or 4 varieties of this which have totally different flowers, but they're all early marsh orchids. And this is a variety Pulchella, and that was at Stony Moors near a caravan site in the New Forest, in the middle of a bog again. By the time you've got to the end of June, the main orchid season is over, and you're really looking for helleborines, which are a kind of orchid which split from orchids early on in the evolution. The difficulty with helleborines is they're really big plants, so they're easy to see, but they tend to occur in 1s and 2s in odd places. But one place where we found quite a lot was Hillia arboretum, under the trees, often in quite dark light. This is a picture of one. You can see it's quite a big plant with a lot of flowers on it. And this is a broad-leaved helleborine. And it has this green-coloured flower. Some of them have a purple tinge, some have a white tinge, so that the flowers are a little bit variable. This one here is a dark red helleborine. I think you can find them in Hampshire, but I've never managed to find them. But the one place where you can't fail to find them is Bishop Middleham Quarry in Durham, where there are probably 100 of them. And this, I think, is a really beautiful helleborine. By August, the helleborines are pretty much finished by the end of August, and you've only essentially one orchid left, and that's Autumn Lady's Tresses, which flowers towards the end of August or in September. And this is a very small, delicate plant. And the flowers tend to spiral around. You can see it here in this one here. This one is in the Royal Victoria Country Park, but also found in Nor Hill again. There's a block of flats, very nice old flats, and these you can see lots of them outside the flats, basically. So that's, if you like, the end of the orchid year in Hampshire and Dorset. If we now go a little bit further afield, we can go to Kent, and Kent is probably the best county for orchids. It's got some really interesting orchids in it. It's slightly warmer than Hampshire, so I think that helps the flowers. This is a lady orchid found at Bonsai Bank in Kent. It's called a lady orchid because it's supposed to be a Victorian lady in her big dress. I don't want to be insulting or anything, but this particular lady is not the most beautiful lady that I've ever seen. But that's a lady orchid. You can see she's got a bonnet on. This is a lizard orchid. Again, this is a speciality of Kent, although they are making their way along the south coast. So there might actually be some in Hampshire. But there's a lot of them at Sandwich Bay, and this is a really bizarre flower. Has this really long curly lip with these arms coming out, curly arms coming out. Very big plant, so you can't miss it, but a very strange plant. This, I think, is really la creme de la creme. This is a late spider orchid, another Ophrys. So this is mimicking insects again. I think there's only two places in the country where you can find these. One is, both of them in Kent. This one was on Folkestone Down, which overlooks the Eurotunnel terminal. When we went to visit it, there was a student who'd been employed for a month or two to guard them, to make sure nobody damaged them or dug them up. But I gather people do go along and dig them up. There's not a lot of point in doing that, because when you dig them up and transplant them, they'll almost certainly die. It's a kind of bee orchid again, but a really, I think this is a beautiful orchid. You get lots of them in Europe, but they've made their way into Kent, and hopefully they might come to Hampshire eventually. If we go up north, you tend to get different orchids, or some different orchids. On the left, we've got the northern marsh orchid, which occurs from about the middle of Wales northwards. South of that, you get the southern marsh orchid, which is a different orchid. I have to say the northern marsh orchid, I think, is more beautiful because it's got this really vibrant color. It's a dactylorhiza, and this particular one was at Carrick-a-Reed on the Causeway Coast. If you ever go to Northern Ireland, to the Causeway Coast, and you go down to the Carrick-a-Reed rope bridge, as you walk down from the car park to the bridge, on the right-hand side, there are two fields full of orchids. Most people walk straight past them, but it's full of orchids, absolutely amazing. This one on the right is a really interesting one. It's called the Tyne helleborine, and this is in Northumberland. This helleborine only grows along the Tyne in areas contaminated with metals from old mine workings. Genetically, it's a dune helleborine, which normally grow in dunes. This one, although it's a kind of dune helleborine, is growing along riverbanks in shingle. And I think this is evolution happening. These are isolated places, totally separate from the dunes, a long way from the dunes. Give it a few thousand years, this may be a new species of orchid. But the geneticists say this is genetically, at the moment, the same as a dune helleborine. And that brings us to hybrids. One of the complications of orchids identification is their liking for hybridization, which they do perfectly naturally. And there's one place where you can really get a good feel for the hybrids, and this is Hartslock, which is on the Thames. And there you find hybrids between lady and monkey orchids. So the lady orchid on the left, we've seen before, has the very big Victorian lady's dress. This is a monkey orchid. If you like, it looks a bit like a Tour de France cyclist, lean and fit, compared with the lady orchid, but otherwise quite similar. They're the same genus, so they can hybridize. There's only one place in the UK, which is Hartslock, where this hybridization has happened. The first hybrid plant appeared in 2006. It's now the dominant species at this site. And on the opening slide, that was a photograph of Hartslock, of all the hybrid orchids. And the next slide shows you a selection of photographs. So this is the plants at a distance. Now, it's a pretty good guess that these are hybrids, because if you look at the number of flowers on these plants, you've probably got nearly 100 flowers on the plant. Typically, a monkey orchid might have a dozen flowers on it. So these, I think, it's pretty clear they're hybrids. This one here is a first example. This is a slightly slimmer version of the lady. And this is probably 70% lady, 30% monkey. This one here is thinner again. This is maybe 50-50. This one here is still a hybrid. It looks like a monkey orchid, but it's still a hybrid. You can see all the flowers. This is just the top end of it. This is probably 90% monkey orchid. So it's very clear that you can see that they're hybridized. So these are fairly easy to identify. But when you come to the dactylorhiza orchid, it is almost impossible sometimes to identify a dactylorhiza orchid. So you've got the common spotteds, you've got the southern marsh, you've got the northern marsh, you've got the early marsh, you've got all these different kinds of dactylorhiza orchids, and they love hybridizing. This one here is the Southern Marsh. You remember the deep purple one? This is a pale pink version. And the flower, the lip, you've got mainly spots, the occasional solid or semi-solid line. The spots are confined to the middle region of the lip. And that's a classic Southern Marsh orchid. You then come to this one. This one is a subspecies of the Southern Marsh. And to me, this looks like a hybrid. But apparently, according to the experts, it's a subspecies. It's got quite a big lip, like a common spotted. The leaves, some of the leaves are spotted, some aren't. It's got the big solid swirls in the middle. But the thing that makes it a little bit different is it's got the markings going quite close to the edge. So that's a subspecies. That's not a hybrid. So that's confusing. This one here is a hybrid. Very striking. The markings go all the way to the edge. It's very noticeable. And it's a hybrid of Praetomissa and Schoenfehler. This one here, the bottom right, is a mutant. The flower hasn't developed properly. And you've got this really quite nice plant with a bow tie on its lip. And there was only one of these in the whole of the field where we went to look at the orchids. So I think that's a very unusual plant, as is this hybrid here. And this is the problem. If you go to Hoe Road, the Hoe Road Meadow in Bishop's Waltham in May, you'll find hybrid, you'll find Southern Marsh, you'll find common spotted and a whole pile of hybrids, and it's very difficult separating them. The really good thing about hybrids is they're big, they're blousy, you get some really good plants, and just look at this one. This is one we spotted in by the river in Londonderry. It's absolutely amazing plant. 3 feet tall. I mean, normally a common spotted would be a foot tall if you're lucky. Often smaller. This one 3 feet tall. Absolutely amazing plant. Okay, I think that's just about 45 minutes or nearly 45 minutes. So I think I've kept fairly well to time, Mike. I just wanted to do a plug for orchids, not just native wild orchids, but also tropical orchids. There are 2 local orchid societies. There's the Bournemouth Orchid Society and the Wessex Orchid Society. Both have websites with meetings, and they often do talks on wild orchids as well as cultivated orchids. And they hold 2 shows a year, one in the autumn, one in the spring. Of course, with COVID, they haven't held meetings for about 18 months, but certainly Wessex Orchid Society hope to hold a meeting in the autumn. And so if you go to the website, that will say when it is, assuming it happens. And it's held at Porchester Community School on White Hart Lane in Porchester. And the orchids are just 2 examples from my collection of fairly, this case a very beautiful one, and this case a really weird one. So thank you very much for your listening.